feel free, go grab some coffee still, go get another donut. We are just so glad that you are worshiping with us this weekend, on Memorial Day weekend. Thank you for taking the time. And if you're new here, I'm Pastor Chris, and we are grateful that you're with us. As Erica was saying, please fill out that connection card that's on your seat. You can drop it at the Horizon info table as you leave today, and we would love to follow up with you. That is your next step today, if you would just fill that out if you're new with us today. So thank you. We're finishing off a series called 167. If you haven't picked this up yet from the weeks before, there are 168 hours in a week. And yet, we often think God is only involved in one of those. And so what do we do with the other 167 hours of our week? We live our lives so often only giving God just the one. But God wants all 168 hours of our lives. How do we give God our hours at work? How do we give God our hours with our family? How do we give God honor when we're at the gym? And it's been really exciting this week, or in the last few weeks, going through this series, getting to hear feedback from y'all. Particularly, I think the two that I've gotten the most feedback from were the first week when we talked about Sabbath. We talked about that 1 hour that we start with when we intentionally focus on resting with God. I've heard how that's impacted our lives. It's made us rethink our devotional life to be able to instill Sabbath in little moments, in those little gaps in our life during the rest of our 167. And I've heard a lot of feedback this week about last Sunday's message on work. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to this, please go back and take a moment, listen to them on the podcast this week while you're driving in the car, you're at the gym, you're working out, you're on a long run. Take moments, because so often our work becomes a burden and we forget the purpose that God created us for and how our work can glorify God. And so this week we're going to be starting in John chapter 15. It's part of Jesus' last teachings here as he's sharing that Last Supper in the book of John. And so John 15, starting at verse 4, it says, "Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me." So, Eric and I have 3 citrus trees in our front yard. They're along our driveway. They're only about yay high still. They're probably about as wide as they are high. They're more like a bush at this point. I guess that's what they are, like they're more of a bush. I don't really know. We're really testing out. We're trying to live into like our full Florida life right here. And so we went to Home Depot, it's probably 3-4 years ago now, and we bought a lemon tree, we bought a lime tree, and we bought an orange tree. Like, this is like the epitome of we want to be Florida right here in our front yard. And so we have planted them, but I couldn't tell you which one is which now 3 years later, because none of them have ever bared any fruit. Except for this year, one of the trees has this little tiny like green thing on it. And I'm definitely like counting my chickens before they hatch here. Like, I'm counting on this, whatever it is. It might turn yellow, it might stay green, it might turn orange. But I have no idea at this point which one it is. And in this teaching from Jesus about Jesus being, I am the true vine, he says, no branch can bear fruit by itself. And I have no idea what tree this vine is connected to that's growing in our yard, but it's bearing fruit for us. And if we don't remain in Jesus during the rest of our 167, how are we going to bear the fruit that Jesus is wanting in our lives? Erica started off this series looking at the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 12. And you probably have heard this scripture before. In Romans chapter 12, it starts, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Chapter 12 marks a very big shift in Paul's writing here in Romans. The first 11 chapters, 1 through 11, were all about Jesus for Paul. It was about what Jesus did and who Jesus was. And now Paul makes this shift. And if you've grown up in church and you went to Sunday school, you went to Horizon Kids growing up, you might have heard something like this. And if you don't take anything else from this sermon, you can remember this one scripture study, little technique here. If you ever see the word therefore, you have to ask yourself what it's there for. And so Paul is marking this big shift. This is important here. He's marking this big shift about who Jesus was and what Jesus did to therefore, how are our lives? How is our 167 shaped? Therefore, because of who Jesus was and what Jesus did for us, therefore our lives are different. And so this shift in the book of Romans happens here in chapter 12. And this is where Erica started this series about Sabbath here in chapter 12. And so when we keep going in chapter 12, when we go to verse 13, it says, "Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited." We're going to focus on that first verse in 13 there. That last sentence of it. It's a short 2-word sentence, and it says, practice hospitality. Practice hospitality. If we are to bear the fruits that the world knows that we are connected to the vine that is Jesus, we've got to be people that are practicing hospitality. And see, in the ancient culture, in the ancient world, hospitality was a deep part of who you were. You were expected to practice hospitality. The Jewish people, it was a deep part of who they were. It's who they are today. It's part of the reason why we're in this space, because of their deep sense of hospitality. The scriptures say in Exodus that you are to care for the foreigner, for the stranger. You are to look after them because you know what it's like to be the stranger, to be the outcast, to be the foreigner. Because you were that when you were in Egypt, the scriptures say. Don't mistreat the stranger. Don't mistreat the outsider. Practice hospitality is the call of the Jewish people. And I think we have to turn the question to ourselves, to us. Have you ever felt like the outsider? Have you ever felt like you were outside the circle? Since I'm the one up here with the mic, I will volunteer to go first to answer that question. I think back to those awkward middle school days, right? When I had glasses before I got contacts. And I felt like the biggest nerd, and I was trying to find my place and fit in. And I think even to my adult times, when I go to a pastor's convention or a meeting, and I'm like, man, oh, that's that guy that published that book, and he's in that video, and he's got this YouTube following, and I feel like, why am I even here? Like, I don't fit in. I'm not that. I feel like I'm an outsider. And when you really kind of start to break it down, I think about my whole life, and there are so many parts, literally all parts of my life you can look at, and I have felt like I was outside. Everyone else was connected. They knew the lingo, and yet I was different. I was different. Are there spots in your life where you feel like you are outside that circle? There's a circle where everyone else is inside except for you. Everyone else is inside. Everyone else is BFF, and you are outside of that circle. The thing is, everyone has a circle. Everyone has a circle. Everyone has a circle. It might even be a little smaller than this circle. Maybe it's only a couple friends and a few family members. But you have a circle where you're on the inside. You have a circle where you're on the inside. And you have to ask yourself, who's not in your circle? Who's on the outside of your circle? And when you think about it, when you get specific, there's probably someone that's a little weird, that's a little strange, that's a little different, that's outside of your circle. That's outside of your circle. And what does Paul say about our circles? Paul says, practice hospitality. This simple 2-word sentence, practice hospitality. It took me a little while to read this, and I was definitely never, if I wanted to feel like an outsider, I would have gone to Mrs. Bell's 9th grade English class, because I was terrible at English. And it took me a little while to figure this out when studying the scriptures this week, to be honest with you, that the verb here, because you have to have a noun and a verb in a sentence, the verb here is practice. And I think because we use practice so often as a noun, like I'm going to take my kid to practice, that practice here is the verb. Practice is the action that Paul is calling us to practice, to do something about hospitality. And Paul says, invite that person into your circle. Invite that person into your circle. And how do we do this, practically speaking? How do we do this? Well, the first step to solving any problem is to acknowledge that there is a problem. So you have to acknowledge that there are people that are outside of your circle. And then you take that next step. Take that next step. Things that I have found that are helpful to take that next step to invite them in is simply to make eye contact. A warm smile with someone goes a long way. If you're at work, are there people that don't have a seat at the table, that don't have a voice? Do you invite them to speak? When you walk into the room, who's over there standing by themselves? Who's sitting by themselves? Do you invite them to stand with you? Do you invite them to come sit with you? Who is that person that's outside of your circle that's clearly different? Because there is someone that's outside of your circle. And if you want to go a step further, which Horizon people do, because we like to ignite change in our lives, right? We like to ignite change in this world. You want to practice some radical hospitality? Don't just invite them to your circle. Go to theirs. Enter into their circle. Because that's the actual active thing of hospitality. To go to theirs. That the initiative is on us as people who follow Christ. Go to the outsider. You follow Jesus, you make the initiative. It's on you. And when you really start digging in to what to practice hospitality meant to Paul in the first century, to the Jewish culture, to practice hospitality was an exceptionally radical thing. Exceptionally radical. This is not just offering a glass of water to a stranger. To practice hospitality meant you invited a stranger in to your home. And it wasn't just to invite them in for a meal or they would leave just in a few hours. To practice hospitality in this world was to invite someone into your home to stay. And I don't know if you are anything like me, but my home is my castle. It is my sanctuary. And speaking frank, I just want to put a number on it. There are probably about 95% of people that I don't really want to invite into my home to stay. And it might even be higher than that. But let's keep it there. I'll give 5% when I'm feeling in a good mood. And this is probably just me, right? I'm probably the only one that feels this way. Like we have a guard dog. It's named Pepsi, and she will hopefully bite you, but she'll probably just lick you at the door. Like, my home is my sanctuary. It is my castle, and I am not inviting in people to stay. But yet, Paul is calling us to this radical way of life. This radical way of life. These words that Paul gives us today are absolutely radical. When God enters into our 167 and transforms it, it will change us deeply. When you entered the room, did we do as Paul did today? Did we find the person in the lowest position and go talk to them? Did we go sit with them? What about those neighbor kids? We probably are the only ones that have them. They actually have moved from our block, so now I'm a little disappointed because now we don't have less talked about in the neighborhood. But we had these kids that were homeschooled, and so they were always just running the neighborhood at all hours of the day. And it's like, are these kids not in school? We had a name for them. I will refrain from that name today. But yet I did not take the time when they were home during the day to want to be a mentor to them, to even get to know them. I just gave them a label and said they're up to no good in the middle of the day. When we're at work, is there someone that you have noticed? We have very talented people in this room who I know are bringing alongside younger people behind them. Is there someone that you've noticed that is super talented, would add value to your organization, and yet they don't have a voice right now? They don't have a seat at the table in the boardroom. Are you willing to bring them alongside, give them a voice, so much so that they might even be competition for you one day? But you know they are talented and they need that voice shared right now. Did you know that there are somewhere every day in the state of Florida between 500 and 700 kids in the foster care system that don't have a permanent placement? What if Horizon Church invited kids into our homes? Why would we do any of these things? Why would we do this? Because in light of everything that Jesus has done for us, he's asking us to give him our 167. To make hospitality part of our whole being, our whole life. And the irony of this all is that the place that people feel the most outside the circle can be at church and around people that follow Jesus. They think they're too messed up, they're too jacked up, their lives are in too many different places to be a part of this circle. They don't know the Jesus lingo. They don't know the Bible verses. There's no way that they would fit in here. But yet, there is no one in all of history that was better at showing hospitality than Jesus. Everywhere he went, the outsiders became insiders. The zealots, the tax collectors, became insiders. Sinners became insiders. Fishermen became insiders. Prostitutes became insiders. Tax collectors became insiders. The poor became insiders. The sick became insiders. Those that were racially different became insiders. People who were outside of the religious circle became insiders when Jesus came to town. And I think the hard truth for us is that those religious folks who beat their chest because they believed they were inside were often found outside of this movement Jesus was awakening. And we stand here today as people who follow Jesus, and Jesus has now made you an insider. And maybe that's why you came today. because you are feeling a little bit like an outsider and you wanted to know what it was like to be inside again. Because he still today can make an outsider an insider. And our response once we get to the inside is to practice hospitality, to invite that one person in, just one. We know the story of the 99 when Jesus goes and looks for the one. To invite that one person in, to share a meal with one person. Or maybe Jesus is inviting you to be even more radical today. Practicing some hospitality, inviting them into your circle, or maybe even going to theirs. And here's the thing. If you think back to that first person who shared their faith with you, that first person who invited you to church, maybe it was that person that brought you to Horizon. You never forget about that first person who invited you, who shared Jesus with you. You never forget them, because in a healthy spiritual way, you always kind of feel a little bit indebted to them. They invited you in when you needed it the most. I know in my own life, I will never forget the person that invited me in when I felt like my life was falling apart, when I felt outside, when my life was so broken and I needed it the most. Do you want this morning God to move through all of your life? Do you want Jesus to invade your 167? This is your challenge this week. Invite one person. Invite one person. Whether it's inviting them here to this circle, it's inviting them in your home to share a meal. It's inviting them in to the boardroom table because their voice is needed. Invite one person and allow Jesus to invade your 167. I'm going to invite the band up at this moment, and we're going to do something a little different this morning. You can come up too. We're going to do it a little bit different because at the end of the day, I'm a football coach, and this whole series in some ways, to 167, we often think of Sunday morning, and I think pastors, we can get into this, that this is like game day, like this is game day right here. But that's missing the point. This is practice for the rest of our 167, right? When we are here, we are practicing. We're not doing push-ups. But we are going to do a little spiritual discipline here this morning. I want you, because I believe Jesus is laying on everyone's heart, one action, one step to take, one person to invite, that name of that person, or maybe it's a new habit we're taking up to let Jesus invade your 167. Maybe you're still thinking about how Sabbath is needed in your life, or your work has been a burden on you, and you need Jesus to continue to shape that. You have one thing that Jesus is on your heart. And so we're going to, because our faith is not lived in rows, it's in circles. And so I want you to find two other people, find groups of three, and we're going to spend just a couple minutes in prayer. If one person in that group would pray, or everyone feels called to pray, we're going to practice this work because we cannot leave it here today. All right? So move these chairs around, make this room a little more messy, and we are going to live in a radical and different way this morning.